In 2024, South Africa's overall gender gap score was at a 0.79, placing South Africa 18th out of 146 countries globally. And I think we all know that while women make up the majority of the population in South Africa, there's still quite a major gap in women's empowerment. And I think today, as we discuss the Women's Empowerment Index and what it's about, it would be interesting to hear how the inroads are being made in bridging that gap. So I'll just sit and welcome our speakers in this segment. Starting with you, Tanya. Very long CV. So Tanya Vogt, have I gotten it right? She's an executive officer for the South African Medical Technology Industry Association. Tanya has a BA honors from Wits University, majoring in African literature and archaeology. She currently is the executive officer of the South African Medical Technology Industry Association, as I've said, SAMED, a position she's held since January 2007. SAMED is a not-for-gain voluntary trade association and aims to be the voice of the medtech industry in South Africa. Its members include medical device, medical equipment, and in vitro diagnostics companies in South Africa. And there's quite a lot after that, but I'll just jump towards the end for the interest of time. Tanya believes emphatically in women's empowerment and continues to work to bring this into the heart and minds of all the medtech sectors in South Africa. Personally, Tanya is a single mom with a special needs adult son. She adores her son, 2 cats, and enjoys meditation, gardening, wine tasting, walking, and finds solace and inspiration being in nature. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you.
Then I'd like to also introduce Namhla. Namhla Mniki is a sustainability catalyst, a seasoned political advisor and global leader renowned for expertise in sustainable development, poverty eradication, and gender transformation. She serves as a Deputy Director General and Technical Lead with the Private Office of the President of the Republic of South Africa, leading special programs on women's economic empowerment and poverty eradication. She is also the co-chair of the Women's Economic Assembly, launched by President Cyril Ramaphosa in 2021. Namhla is also a leadership strategist supporting emerging leaders in Africa to leverage their personal power, values, and skills to transform their work environment. I could say so much more. There's a lot more to say, but I think I'd rather hear from them. Thank you. Welcome, ladies, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, our chair. My audio is all right? Everybody can hear me well? All right. How's everyone doing? My word. My word. I'm surrounded by powerhouses and I refuse to be intimidated. So yeah. So as you've heard, my name is Namhla Mniki and I sit as a technical lead and advisor within the private office for now. In the presidency of South Africa, sorry, I should have said. It is an absolute privilege for me to be here in your midst. I think it's the first time that I'm having an opportunity to be here. And my sis over there, Delia, is the reason why I'm here. And I really just want to appreciate you, appreciate Women Boards, I appreciate EmpowerWorks. And I'm delighted to be here with Tanya, who has been one of our trailblazers in the things I'm going to talk to you about. So I've been thinking a lot in the last few years about building or rebuilding nations. And I think in the world that we live in, I mean, we're getting more fragmented by the minute, but in the world we live in, I think all of us in this room are fairly familiar with the fact that the world seems to be structurally and quite systemically structured in such a way that it devalues women's contribution in the economy, period. I could say that in many different ways, but the bottom line and the numbers and the data tells us that, the value of women, I think, is welcome to the extent that it helps organizations, institutions achieve certain things, but the power that it's supposed to be accompanied with is where the crisis begins, whether it is about pay parity, etc. When I was brought into the private office of the president about 4 years ago, the president at the time was particularly worried about driving an agenda for women's economic participation in the economy, but moving away from tinkering on the edges and actually dealing with the real structural barriers that stopped women from participating. I think up until that point, we had done everything we could to talk about women employment levels or data, pay parity, and those kinds of things. And so essentially the discourse was around representation. And don't get me wrong, that's a very important discourse. But when we begin to understand what economic power really means, we know that it means women actually having access to real economic power, which means means of production. In the South African context, means of production is defined as women owning businesses, assets that they can use in the economy to invest, reinvest, grow their wealth. And so moving from a survivalist understanding of what women should be doing to women actually bringing their agency into an economy. Agency is something of a passion of mine, the really important one, because it forces us to think beyond what are the inputs and the cosmetic look of what women's participation looks like. And it begins to say, actually, we want to create open economies where women have the choice, the opportunity, the access, and the power to make decisions about how they want to engage with an economy. And that's why we talk about transitioning from just talking about women in employment to talking about women owning the means of production and actually becoming active agents in the economy and being recognized for the contribution that they make in the economy. And I could go into some numbers about what we know would happen, for instance, if there was, equality in women's access to finance, as an example. And we know that the South African economy and African economies would grow exponentially if we simply just had gender parity across the board in economic participation. So we began to do this work, and one of the ways that we were thinking about this in terms of just changing the structural nature of the economy was, how do we begin to support women who own businesses to actually participate in supply chains and value chains of industries? Now, of course, this work is quite shocking to discover the reality of the South African economy. And just basically across the board, if I could summarize it, we've got 17 sectors identified by DTIC. Out of those 17 sectors, primarily the people or the organizations, companies, and corporates that own between 85 and 95% of the market share in those industries are largely international large corporations. I want you to kind of let that sink in for a bit so that you can understand what that means for South Africa. Many people talk about 30 years having passed without us actually accessing economic power. But actually, when we started designing things like BEE and then triple BEE, the reason why that's not working is because there's no opportunity for a South African to own Coca-Cola because the shareholding is not in South Africa. It's not even available for sale, right? So when you begin to talk ownership of the economy, because South Africa is so dominated by large, established 100-year-old companies, it's really difficult for South Africans to actually get into and own those industries, which essentially means localizing then becomes very difficult. Localizing manufacturing, localizing our value chains, because global entities, rightfully so, have global value chains. So even though we're saying women must come and own businesses and begin to participate, we were realizing that the market share they have access to is probably less than 5% at the stage, more like 1%, 0 point something percent. And then the barriers to entry are so significant that it becomes very difficult for women to, number one, get into their foot on the door, but once they have done that, to actually compete in a meaningful way. Because competition essentially means if you are trying to be a component manufacturer in automotives, you are dealing with OEMs who are basically global companies that have been running the show for literally centuries, as it were. So massive, massive, massive challenges. And I'm going to bring it down to where I see the vision and the hope with you sitting in this room and with you sitting in the boards that you sit in and the excos that you sit in, because I think that there's an incredible opportunity there. So when we started talking then about value chain diversification, the idea that you intentionally identify within each of the 17 industries, what are the opportunities for women to come in? Not because we want to fight for the pie, the piece of the pie that's already been taken, but because we want to try and understand where are new opportunities where we can grow those industries and grow the opportunities, as it were. And we began to actually navigate whether it's energy, mining, automotives, I've spoken about, FMCG, etc. We began to say, let's understand where are the opportunities where women can say we are starting businesses. But it was not enough for women to start these businesses. It was also important that then they actually get procurement opportunities in those sectors. Because supply chain or the supply value chain really is probably the most critical space where women and emerging entrepreneurs, designated groups, whether it is young Black men, whether it is persons with disabilities, but it truly is the only opportunity where somebody who has a small business can say, I have a chance to grow this business. Yes, I'm not going to fight for that particular market share, but I want the opportunity to grow my business and have a sustainable access to market. And so that essentially is what led to the establishment of the Women Economic Assembly, which is in short called WECONA. It is a partnership, a private-public partnership between the public sector, women entrepreneurs in South Africa, fabulous, incredible women doing incredible things in these value chains, but also industry, where we began to negotiate for specific targets that would essentially go to women in terms of procurement that was available. So that's kind of like, in the nutshell, our own vision of how we build or rebuild the South African economy. So what do we call that in a very short kind of like phrase? It's essentially this idea of thinking about rebuilding in a gender transformative way. And so we use a gender transformative lens to say what is actually needed in order for us to see the kind of transformation we need. I want to kind of emphasize a little bit on this gender transformative lens because I find that it's very difficult to talk about the tangible things without being clear on what are the criteria that you are using to understand whether something is gender transformative or not. So often, and this was an amazing thing that I discovered 4 years ago when I started this work, is that we would go and see industry associations, and they would be saying, yes, we are committed to making sure that women come into industry. We want representation. We want them in our boards. We want them in our excos. We want to ensure that there's pay parity and so on. And I will confess, as somebody who formerly came from civil society and then in the public sector, that I did not find a lot of resistance in the words and the principles of gender transformation in companies, right? Like that was not the thing that met me as a first thing. The first thing was people who were saying, oh no, we are for this agenda. Where there was a gap quite significantly was, but how do we translate the principle into action and into things that lead to results that we want to see on the ground? And basically what we began to do as WECONA is to try and figure out what are the tools that are going to help us, to help CEOs and chairs of boards to understand that it's not just about saying in your annual report every year, we support women. It's also about turning that into tangible results. So we looked at this gender transformative lens and we gave it 6 very important criteria. Number 1, you should, in a particular industry, be concerned about how many women are actually participating in that industry as owners of business. Number 2, very importantly, what is the extent to which women actually have access to supply opportunities in those industries? So essentially, offtake agreements, supplier contracts. So if you're sitting in a board and you're having conversations about, performance and DEI, etc., the question at the top of anybody's mind should be, what is the proportion of spend we have on suppliers who are women or women-controlled or women-led businesses? That's what that second criteria is about. It's about saying, how much do we buy goods and services from women? Now, here's an interesting story. and I'll tell the story about the public sector in particular, because then the data becomes nuanced, because the nature of the gender transformative lenses is that you move beyond the cover, right? You move beyond the pretty picture to actually look at the nuance that underlies the statements that are being made. So I used to sit with public sector leaders and they would say, oh, we spent 20 billion this year on women. You have to ask, 20 billion in proportion to how much overall spend? If that 20 billion sounds amazing until you find out that overall they spent 500 billion, and then you're like 20 billion vis-a-vis 500 billion. So you have to be willing to say, yes, I understand the figure, but what's the proportion? Once you've understood the proportion, then you want to ask the question around quantity and quality, right? So you could say 20 billion, and this is something like an actual thing that happened where I discovered that this big number that was being mentioned only went to 2 companies owned and run by women. And so the idea of actually asking, okay, but is this one person who has been your favorite supplier for the last 20 years and you're just refusing to change, but you want to mention that you've given her the money? So the idea around thinking about a gender transformative lens, which is why Tanya and the work around the Empowerment Index has been so good, is that it helps us to move beyond the idea and the principles to say, we actually want to measure what counts. Because it's not just how many women are owning businesses. It's not just how many women are getting supplier contracts. It's how much you're spending on those women vis-a-vis your overall spend. And it's how many of those women you're actually spending on. A couple of the other criteria we use is, one of the things that has been so critical in our work is ecosystems of support. This idea that actually having a wonderful target there doesn't ensure that women can access the opportunities that are available, because there are 3 things that generally stop women from accessing those things. Either access to finance, access to the information that's needed, as well as access to the capacity that's needed. And so we have to find a way of creating the kinds of enabling environment that closes the gap so that women can know what opportunities are available, that's access to information, that they can have the funding that allows them to actually provide the goods and services that is required, that's access to finance, and that they can have the skills and the capacity to deliver what is required at that particular time. I could say a lot more, because we have, as I said, a 6-point criteria, and I know that, I'm giving you lots of information, but I just want to get to the point where I'm saying the work, the heavy lifting has been around moving beyond what we say to actually thinking about practically, what does this look like? And what are the questions we're asking in boards? What are the questions we're asking the CEOs? What are the questions we're asking the procurement managers who are making the decisions about how much money is going to women? So when we launched the Presidential Index for Gender Inclusive Supply Chains, this then becomes the tool through which we actually translate the things I'm talking about, because it actually looks at each of these criteria and it says, actually, you tell us as a company, you tell us as an industry, what are you spending on women? And it's the one thing that's going to allow us to be able to tell the story of how we are growing over time, so that really the businesses are improving in their gender diversified supply chains, but also that more and more women are actually getting those opportunities that they need as business owners. So my call to you would be, think about the questions that as you're sitting there as a decision maker, you're asking, so that the numbers themselves don't just dazzle, but what the numbers mean. And those questions help you to move beyond asking about the inputs to asking about the impact and the results that we are actually seeing. The bottom line, and I think that this is the last thing I will say, the bottom line is that our agenda is to transform South Africa's economy in a meaningful way. We know that the economy of South Africa and the African continent and globally, we are never going to reach the full potential without actually ensuring that we can increase the value and the agency of women in the economy, simply because South Africa itself needs South African women in order for it to thrive. And of course, we've seen that in the spaces where women are operating. But But the work of uprooting what's not working and then replacing it with the ideas that work, I think is what this Empowerment Index does. And we're very grateful because when Ms. Delia was in Deloitte, she led the process of actually helping us work on this Empowerment Index. And now she is Wikona's champion for this transformative index. She's going to be helping us to mobilize stakeholders in the private sector to adopt it. And then SAMED became the very first association in industry that actually adopted the transformation index. And so, I mean, I think you've had Tanya being introduced already, but she's now going to be taking us through what they did as SAMED, why it is that they chose to adopt the index, but also what it has been able to tell them. And I think that that's going to be exciting just to see it in the meat and flesh, as it were. So a round of applause for Tanya as I hand over to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Namhla. So, the previous speaker, Tasneem, mentioned that how she got onto a board or onto boards was through meaningful relationships. And I think how we got to this index was really about knowing certain people and building relationships, and in particular, Delia. But how I got to know Delia was through my then chairperson, Peter Mklape, who really is a champion of transformation in our sector. He has spearheaded something called the Women in MedTech initiative. And although we had a number of these forums prior to beginning the index, we just weren't measuring the metrics that mattered. Mm. And so when Delia and I met and she mentioned the index as a potential tool, and also how it tied in with the president's announcements at, I think it was the October 2022 WICONA,
right,
that we need to increase procurement of public sector business for women to 40%. Yeah. This aligned with that vision. But it also aligned with our strategic vision as an organization. SAMED's vision is a sustainable, transformed, and ethical medical technology industry in South Africa. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the why in our industry. Maybe Anita, if you can change to the next slide for me. Let's see. Okay. So these are some international, but also some local metrics around gender disparity. But in our sector, actually 38.4% of the workforce in the medtech sector are women. And only 25% of C-suite positions, leadership positions, are women. So we really have a big problem, and we need to find ways to resolve that. So the index helps us to, let me just move ahead. Okay, so the index gives us an opportunity to look at how we as a sector can make a difference. Okay, but it also will hopefully increase the ability for our sector to actually tap into that 40% vision of the president in terms of procurement from women-owned businesses. So what does it look like, or why does it matter to us? So just a little story. I don't know if any of you know, but over the last 10 years, cardiovascular disease in women is actually presenting very differently to men. Yet, we've always treated it as if women were men. And so this has caused a lot of misdiagnosis. And in fact, women have suffered heart attacks that if they had been diagnosed and treated differently because they're women, we wouldn't have these high statistics. Also, in our sector, women hardly participate in clinical trials. Clinical trials are dominated by men. And even in terms of the R&D and the innovations in the medtech sector, it's men engineers who are making these discoveries and inventions. So it's not just about growing the economy, adding to the community. It's actually about how do we impact the health of women down the line. So it goes beyond all of those wonderful things, Namhla, that you mentioned that are important as to why we actually improve women empowerment. Okay. So if you look at the actual index and how we got there, oops, there we go. What we did was we partnered with a specialist organization, and that was Deloitte. And they looked at thought leadership, they looked at best practice, they looked at research, they looked at the local numbers, they looked at the international numbers. And we identified 5 key metrics. And these metrics are women ownership, women leadership, women employment and representation in the organization, women development, and women remuneration. But then we also decided that we couldn't just take those metrics that are sort of broadly really important and matter and impose them on our membership. We needed to make sure that there was diversity of opinion, that there was inclusion of the membership, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to be committed to making sure that these metrics improve and that they participate in the initiative. So we held a number of workshops with our members. We made sure that we had diverse opinion. We had men on those workshops. We had women on those workshops. We had women from different levels in the organization. We made sure that we had different size organizations. You spoke about, very large corporations, and it's very difficult for women to become owners of those. So we made sure we had multinationals. We had local companies, so local manufacturers. We had small to medium distributors. And we had this cross variety of different entities within our sector participate in those working groups. We also did a survey amongst our members. We wanted to make sure that the metrics that we were measuring were fit for purpose and that they made sense to our sector. Okay, so we weren't just imposing something that might be globally accepted onto our sector. And we did this for a specific reason. We wanted to make sure that the members will participate and be committed to the metric, because it's a voluntary index. It's not mandatory, and that they would see the purpose behind it. So within those 5 metrics, we identified a number of sub-metrics. And to your point, Namhla, it's not just percentage of women ownership, it's percentage of interaction with women-owned businesses. Okay, so what is the percentage that of women-owned or women-empowered businesses that your organization does business with or contracts with? So that's an important metric to push the needle. We also looked, for example, we know in South Africa, we have the highest level of youth unemployment. So an important metric that we as an organization and as a sector realized we needed to work on was the number of women learnerships that our member companies are participating in, okay? And even the percentage of women, yes, youth that they're employing and giving a learnership opportunity. But we didn't leave out the disabled. That's also one of the metrics, sub-metrics. And there are a number of questions that relate to each of those sub-metrics. I haven't gone into the great detail, but all in all, there is a questionnaire that the member companies provide data on. It's not a long questionnaire. I think there are 10 questions in total. So you've got to make it simple and easy for people to participate. And each of these sub-metrics are weighted. Okay, again, those weightings were arrived at in terms of the survey that we did with the members. So we identified what were the metrics that were more important and therefore needed to be weighted slightly more than others. And that can change over time. As this landscape develops, as we improve in these metrics, we can adapt the index. So it's a really flexible and agile index. Just move to the next slide. Okay, so what we did was we actually built a live online platform that the companies can go in and input their data at any point in time. And they then have the ability to view their progress. They can compare themselves. So for example, here, this is a dashboard. So that would be my company's score. I've got a 44.919% out of 100% score. But in comparison to the aggregate, so if this was a live system, I'd be able to show you that another number would come up here. You can also compare yourself to your competitors, because it made sense for our members to kind of have a target, almost like an incentive of why I'm doing this, okay? And then they can use it for their competitive advantage in their marketing material, when they bid for tenders for government business, and also for them internally to be able to see, okay, my competitor is tracking here, but I'm tracking here. Now, that's not a good thing. I need to maybe, spend a bit more time and energy on this particular metric. What the index also does is you'll see it gives you an overall dashboard, but for each of the metrics, it gives a few dashboards as well. And it's really amazing because when you kind of hover over each of these little columns, it'll tell you what your score is, your company score versus the industry aggregate. It also gives you the ability to compare yourself to similar companies. So if you're a small to medium company, you can compare yourself to other small to medium companies. You can compare yourself to companies with similar triple BEE levels. Okay, so there's a lot of filters that you can apply that made sense for our industry. So that would support people to be incentivized and companies to be incentivized to participate. And finally, you can actually download a certificate, okay, which gives you your total score that you can then use, as I said, for competitive reasons or marketing opportunities. So that's the index. We launched it in August last year. It took us about a year to develop. We've had to do a lot of marketing and advocacy amongst our members. We have tried to use a bit of a push and pull sort of methodology to get the members to participate. And so apart from internally doing a lot of awareness and holding forums and training the members on the index, we've also spoken to some of the key customers of our members. So private hospital groups, for example, and asked them to incorporate the index in the discussions they have with our member companies when they are procuring from them. So we still have quite a way to go. We've got 29 companies that are participating in the index. We are starting to now pull some interesting statistics. What it gives us as an industry association is that we can then determine where the gaps are. And we can start implementing solutions for the members. It could be just identifying how many women-empowered or women-owned businesses exist that could be service providers to our members. And then marketing those women-owned businesses with our members, something like that. When we see that the Yes Youth statistics are very low, it's implementing solutions to how do we get the members to participate in the Yes Youth program. So it is early days, but it's very exciting. I firmly believe that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it, and you can't change it. So this is a tool that takes all the wonderful things we know about gender parity and makes it a reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. That's lovely. So if you can't measure, you can't manage, and then you can't change.
Yeah.
So I think I'll go into questions, but Judith, allow you to ask the question.
Question. So is there a feedback mechanism from the tool into Namhla, your space before policy change? And if there is, how has that been structured?
It's a very good question. You want to answer that?
So we were invited to present at the most recent WeCona, but I think that there's certainly more work that we need to do. I'd like us to get together. I know the minister in the presidency mentioned there was a task team that's being established. And I think that we need to get onto that task team because I would love for this index to be adapted by many other sectors. We need everyone to realize that it's credible, that it's not subjective, that it's objective, and that it's reaping some of the rewards. I think the fact that we didn't know as a sector our metrics, we were operating in the dark. And although the metrics might not look great, okay, and certainly some companies are realizing, whoa, I'm really low here. But the fact of the matter is, before they started, they didn't even know where they were.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we need to do more to get it to kind of, entwine those threads. Yeah.
So, I mean, just to add to that, I would say that in terms of the macro level feedback mechanism, we have the beginnings of that through the mechanism of WECONA, the Women Economic Assembly. But what we tend to focus on at that level are the big macro issues. So, for instance, the fact that this is the first instrument that measures how much companies across the board are procuring from women. Like, so internally companies might have that information, but it doesn't exist in public data. So one of the things that is coming up as a policy issue and something we're advocating for is that, and there's a few other things that have come up, issues related to, for instance, competitive behavior of companies and so on. So we're able to extract that and basically bring it either to the Competition Commission, to DTIC, or whoever the policy instrument or the policy duty bearer is in that case. However, I think what Tanya is talking about is at industry level. That's probably where we need to do a bit more fine tuning, because the very specific industry issues then would be dealt with at the level of industry. So we've worked with SAMED. We've been working with a couple of other industry associations, the Mining Council, Minerals Council, AITF, which is the Automotive Transformation Fund, and we engage with them at the policy level quite a bit, but not in relation to the sectoral changes that need to translate into legislation. We're not there yet. But I have noted it down as one of our feedback mechanisms, yes.
Can I maybe add to that? So in our sector, the medical technology industry is regarded as an area of strategic focus because we contribute, it's now 6% to our trade deficit. The majority of medical devices and technology is imported into the country. So particularly we saw during COVID, our total reliance on imported PPE, gloves, masks, ventilators, etc. And we realized that we needed to change that. I mean, the next pandemic, we can't be in that same situation. So there has been a MedTech master plan that was launched by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. So when we talk about policy, I think there is a link. I see this index as really tying into some of the key objectives and targets of that MedTech master plan, which is increasing employment in our sector, increasing skills, because one of the metrics is about development and mentorship.
Right.
Okay. It's also about growing the local manufacturing industry. So if you have more women owners, okay, most multinationals are not going to give away ownership. Okay. But if you focus on how do we develop women so that they can become owners within our sector and give them the skills they need in order to do and start local manufacturing plants, that also ties into that localization agenda and reducing the trade deficit, which is only good for our economy.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, ladies. There's two questions over there, but I want to go quickly online and also see if there are any questions at the back over there. So the first question from online is from Dilshan. She says, where can we find the information on this 6-point criteria, and where can we find the index itself? I guess we can add. How can women in boards, Anne-Marie is asking, how can women in boardrooms leverage their positions to challenge systemic barriers such as unequal access to capital networks and procurement opportunities that continue to limit women-owned businesses in South Africa? Yeah, we can take those two and then we'll answer.
All right. What is it? Oh, afternoon. My name is Mawatu. This is quite exciting, and I like its noble intention and what it seeks to achieve. You mentioned that there's about 17 sectors, right? Maybe you could just tease out those sectors that probably are being strategically prioritized, because we wear two hats here. So maybe one is sitting here as a board member in order to enhance your oversight and make sure that wherever you're serving, you're able to influence a meaningful contribution towards this empowerment through supply chains. But then there's also the entrepreneur hat, where it's the access to the capital, is also about being able to benefit from those matrices. So which sectors are those? And when I see the stats of government is only reporting on between 1% to 6%, right, of women being able to participate in those supply chains. And then you look at the issues around triple BE, tender irregularities, supply chain challenges, fraud and malfeasance, and all the noise that is often associated with that. And if you come from a profession where it's highly regulated, you're going to want to dabble in there quite cautiously. So if you want to participate, you want to contribute, and you want to be able to access the market, but typically there's a perception of accessing government markets comes with the noise of certain things that one cannot afford. So if we reset all that and one is interested in playing in those spaces, which sectors are prioritized, and how tangible and what systems and support is there to genuinely almost handhold people through that passage so that these stats can start to look a little bit more meaningful. Gonna hand over.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Welile Dlamini. I am an entrepreneur. So this issue touches me directly. I run a woman-owned business, and I'm directly affected by the barriers in our industries and them preventing us in participating. And now I've been listening to Namhla and the forums that have been formulated in assisting women-owned businesses. And my question is, how then, as women-owned businesses, get to understand more about WICONAS and actually participate there? And also what forums like this, where you guys afford us to give feedback on how the industry is affecting us and how can the industry support us as women-owned businesses?
Thank you. Are there questions at the back here? No, okay. So I think I will close.
There's one question.
Oh, there is one, okay. Then after that, we'll close the questions and then answer. Close our session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insight, and I'm really excited to hear that there is a measure that is beginning to show the impact and also show from the medical side some kind of insights that we can use going forward. So the question that I have is, do we have a measure that can also link to women experiences, to your point at the back? Because we need to tie it back to the women experiences. And with that, we'll be able to see the impact. And it can flow nicely into the policy space as well. So the other question is, do we have this reporting tool in all the reporting, for example, of businesses, where they can report it and it can be compulsory for them to see the performance in their reports?
Thank you. Tanya, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I'll try some of them.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you your slide. Sorry, I'm the head of operations at a funding organization. Your slide, I think it was one of your first ones, where you showed the sub-weighting. Yeah, for the different, no, the next one. Your sub-metric weighting. Why is it 0% for all of the ones related to remuneration? And then the second thing I wanted to ask is there, and I know you guys are beginning, but are you considering doing any types of recommendations as to how to change some of the statistics? So, I mean, she mentioned that statistic there, the 1% to 6% of government 1% to 6% of government suppliers. So I work for a government institution, and when it comes to tenders, it's very easy for companies that have many years of experience to get the tenders, right? Because the tender process, I hate to use the term tick box exercise, but that's what it is, right? So if you take all of those different, quality checks that are required in a tender document, if you have the 5 CVs, if you have the 5 letters of recommendation, if you have, doesn't matter how amazing your methodology is, right? It really doesn't matter how amazing, how you're going to do things differently. Yes, that's scored, but it's really just about, it's a matter of probabilities. How probable are you to score 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, 15 out of 15 for the different subcategories? So if you've done this for many years, if you have 20 recommendation letters, if you can, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a matter of probabilities. If you've done this long enough, it's much easier for you to get the tender, right? And then if you want to kind of circumvent the whole BEE thing and you JV with the black company with a nice face that ticks the right box, makes it even easier for you. So once the data's there, are there recommendations to shift some of those things that are those 1 to 6%, those things that are low and that should be higher? Because the procurement system and the PFMA, they are what they are. They're not going to change. And at the end of the day, if you're a Black-owned company, if you're a Black female-owned company, if you don't have 15 years experience, you don't have it. You're not going to score 15 out of 15 in that thing. Doesn't matter how wonderful your methodology is, right? If your CVs, you may have, the point I'm trying to make is that the supply chain system, especially when it comes to tenders and RFQs and all of those things, it's very standard and it's very technical, and you either have the things or you don't. So with all of the work that's done into this, how can this translate into changing that 1 to 6% to making it 7 or 8 or 10%? Because whether it's 20 billion or 30 or 40 billion that the government has given, they can't change the PFMA.
Okay, Tanya, you can.
All right. So I'll tackle some of them if I may. So where to find the index? So we have it listed on our website, but I'm very happy to share with anyone. So, happy to share my email address or my WhatsApp. Please let me know and I can send you information on the index. And really, you can take the index. The platform we developed it at significant cost. That's not available to everyone, but I can talk you through how we developed it, okay, and what was involved. Around measures of women experiences, okay, I think that's very much an area, this is very quantitative. So it's not really looking at the qualitative aspect, but I think that, this is, the index is going to develop. Holding our Women in MedTech forums gives the opportunity for women to give their qualitative experiences. So we're not doing enough with the index. We've just started. I think what I want to see is more of our members participate. You're right, we haven't looked at where the gaps are and how to fill them. That's, I think, something that we really need to work hard on, and we do intend to use the information for that purpose. Around the question of making it compulsory, some of the data, by the way, that goes into the index is compulsory for companies. It's compulsory in terms of their employment equity reporting and their skill spend reporting. So the other stuff might not be, but certainly some of it is compulsory. I think, you almost want people to see this as something that they want to do. So to make it mandatory right up front, I think might actually push people away. So that's why we've chosen to allow it to be voluntary for our members. We're hoping that, well, I believe that we will get an upswell. Our board have committed to it. SAMED has actually completed it ourselves. So there's that tone from the top. But why the zero pay parity? Why are there no scores and weightings for that particular section? Very good question, and thank you for picking that up. Initially, when we developed the index, we wanted to put a weighting to pay parity because it's actually a really, really important metric. It's a massively important metric. But when we had the focus groups and the survey amongst the members, they were reluctant to actually, some of them were reluctant to provide that information. For them, it was very sensitive information. So what we chose to do was we are for now allowing it to be voluntary. Okay. And when we get that uptake, that commitment, that participation, when the members start seeing that it's working, it's important, it's adding value to them as organizations, we'll then make sure that it has a weighting and that it becomes mandatory. Yeah, so that's the only part of the index that is voluntary. The rest of it, you have to give all the data. Participating is voluntary, but the actual questions and whether the questions are mandatory or voluntary, just that section is voluntary. I'm trying to see if there was anything else. How do we support women-owned businesses? Okay, so when I did our index, when I added our little not for gain voluntary trade association, okay, data into the index, it was the first time that I had to go and look at all our service providers. And we don't have a huge number of service providers, but Deloitte is one of our service providers, okay? The catering company that we use for our board meetings is a service provider. The organization we pay our rent to is a service provider. The communications and PR company that we use is a service provider. I started phoning them up and saying, well, how many women own your business? Oh, none. But then how empowered? What is your level of women empowerment? Oh, what do you mean? Well, how many women do you employ? Okay. And how many women-owned or women-empowered service providers do you contract with? And suddenly the conversation was changing. And people were starting to realize, hang on, this is important. And just by having that conversation, okay, I'm saying to those service providers, this is important to SAMED as an organization. So I want you, although you might be on a 0 now, please, I need you to start thinking about this because next year, if you haven't shifted your needle, I'm going to have to think differently about utilizing your services. Okay, so that's how we support women-owned businesses. It might not always be clear and in the headlights, but it's about asking the question and starting to measure it.
Thank you for that. Namhla, I'll give you a short time to just take a few questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for the questions, really great engagement. So the 6-point criteria we have actually dovetails very nicely with the index that you just saw that Tanya was sharing with you. We would be happy to share it and maybe it can be shared to everyone. WeConnor has a website, it's called weconnor.org. And you can just also check out some of our kind of gender transformative tools there. I love to hear that there are entrepreneurs in the room and you are welcome to come join us because we have 17 sectors. As I mentioned before, they align with DTIT sectors. I think the agenda for South Africa in the next few years is to essentially build or rebuild our manufacturing capacity. And so anything that is in the manufacturing space, I think is really, really important. But also adding to that, the mining sector, the green energy space, ICT, digital ecosystems, and AI, a very important one. We have a very robust property sector within WeConnor as well as tourism. And we also have textiles, which includes leather and shoes. So I could go through that whole list, but essentially if you go to our website, you will see each of the industries. The way we work, and this is to your point around how do you participate and become part of what we are doing. I think our model for transformation has been really transformative and radical because even though we've got quite a bit of public sector participation, what we wanted to do was to actually ensure that the women entrepreneurs themselves determine the agenda. And I think this is to your point around women and actually their experiences. So every single one of the sectors has women entrepreneurs who are business owners in that sector actually running the sector. So these are called sector streams, and they are coaches by women entrepreneurs themselves. And it's them who tell us if what the business associations is true or not. It's them who give us insight to what's actually happening in terms of the experiences of women. So we've had stories around price fixing, around this, around that we then in turn take back into the system and bring it so that we can get that transformation taking place or those changes taking place. So I think that system has worked really well. And the participation is free, and we are always looking for people who are actually operating in the sectors who actually want to transform the ecosystem and also to just advise us on what it is we should be doing. I understand the hesitation on public sector tender system. And I think the points you mentioned spot on, and you will not find me in any platform defending the procurement system in the public sector. That's what we're trying to fix. But I think the gap that's often not dealt with, and we're trying to get our DFIs to change this, is basically this thing around if there are people who are playing well with the system and they've figured out how to play well, we want to simply increase the capacity of women to play well as well. So that's the very first thing. The second thing that the public sector is doing, which I think I'm really encouraged by, is the idea of special purpose vehicles. So you heard them talking about the transformation fund, the new 100 billion fund, right? And the idea there is to develop a system that essentially bridges the gap of what the restrictions of the PMFA does, to create mechanisms so that it is responsive to the people who need to use it. So one of the things we have been advocating for, and we just did our submission as we cornered to the transformation fund, was number one, essentially special rules for collateral for women. Number two, a process of pipeline development that would actually handhold women as they are applying for the funds that are available. So all of those things, I think we are using mechanisms that allow us to use them, which are the special purpose vehicles. Another one is NEF, the National Empowerment Fund, which actually now has a pipeline development system that we co-created together that actually enables women to actually have access to these tools and these products. I think that the point around women's experiences is so important, but the women have to be in the spaces where those experiences are being gleaned so that we can take that to where it counts and to the power brokers, as it were. I think the compulsory reporting question has been answered already. In the transformation fund, we've asked them to include procurement actually as a requirement in the reporting as well. So I'm not sure how far we're going to go with that, but I think that that's an important one. I don't know if there's another big one that I might have overlooked.
No.
Have I?
Question about from Anna Marie.
Anna Marie was asking how women in boardrooms can leverage their positions to change this.
Ask the right questions. I think that's my favorite question. Because ask the right questions. Yeah. I think asking the right questions and deferring to tools that exist is the thing that really helps. And so this index is so powerful, because once you are able to kind of cut through the pretty face of like the data we're told and actually ask, no, but what does that actually mean? And is that about just your inputs, or is that about actual impact? And if you want us to kind of like draft the questions and share them, we would be more than happy. No, you know why I say that is because actually the way we got traction in the automotive sector is that two of the women we were working with were chairs of boards in two OEMs. They pushed the agenda, and the chairperson of the AITF was a woman, and they became the champions in there. And as a result of that, AITF said 30% of our 6 billion will go to women-owned and women-controlled enterprises. To date, they are implementing, I think it's over 55% of their overall allocation to women-owned businesses. And it's women who are champions and chairing those boards who are making it happen.
Just a comment. Where are the incentives, I think, from government side? I think everyone responds to either incentives or regulation, right?
Yeah.
So regulation is happening. Where are the incentives? Because I feel that there has to be a little bit of sweetener
Yeah.
from the government, be it policy, be it tax.
Yeah.
What are they doing that?
Right. You want to answer that?
Yeah, so
I'm happy. It's the,
Grants and incentives.
yeah,
And that's it.
yes.
Yeah.
But
and the BEO points, of course, as well.
Yes.
So, yeah.
But actually from a procurement perspective, and I think this is where we need to do more marketing of the index, the provincial departments of health can, as part of the procurement regulations, implement certain transformational targets when they send out tenders. So they can put women ownership as one of the transformational, criteria. And they're not doing enough of that. We've seen that in one of the tenders that was published in the Eastern Cape for medical technology, in fact, in orthopedics, which traditionally, by the way, is a very male-oriented subsector of healthcare and the medtech industry. You often find mainly orthopedic surgeons are men. So we have to change that narrative as well. And most of the reps, by the way, in our medtech industry companies who support the surgeons happen to be men. So yeah, so I think we need to speak to the procurement officials as well. Yeah.
Thank you, ladies. I'll close the meeting. I do want to come back here again. But thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause, please.